Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Paradigm Shifts podcast with your host, Keisha Kruger. I'm an organization development practitioner and executive coach, working with leaders to create positive changes in the workplace using behavioral science. My personal mission? Share science-based tools and leadership insights from the field that you can use in the workplace and beyond. Considering we spend about 3/4 of our lifetime at work, there is incredible science and organizational psychology that can be used to rethink the way we work, lead, and ultimately live. Join me as I speak with thought leaders and business leaders in practice, unpacking lightbulb moments for paradigm shifts. Hello, everyone. On this week's episode, we get the pleasure of hearing from Nelson Sivalingam, who is the CEO and co-founder of HowNow, the learning experience platform making learning a part of everyday work, supporting scale-up companies including Depop, Vanmoof, and Checkout.com, and global enterprises like Mercer, Sanofi, and Investec. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Do yourself a favor, click it right now. We've got some incredible guests coming in that you won't want to miss, like this one. He's also the author of Learning at Speed, which brings together the best lean and agile methodologies and shows how they can be applied to learning and development to improve individual and organizational performance. Nelson co-hosts L&D Disrupt, the live podcast that asks disruptors, leaders, and industry game changers burning questions about building fast learning organizations that are prepared for the future of work. So if you want to learn more about Nelson, his company, HowNow, or his book and his services, be sure to check out the show notes. This is going to be an exciting one, guys. Hi, Nelson. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on your show. Really looking forward to it.
Thank you for being here. You recently released a book called Learning at Speed. And so you are a true learning expert. So I'm so excited to chat with you, tap into all of this good knowledge that you have around building a learning ecosystem. So I want to start there. What is a learning ecosystem?
Yeah, good question. Otherwise, the rest of this episode would not make sense. But I guess there are kind of varying definitions of this. But how I look at a learning ecosystem is, if we think about when was the last time we learned something that had a big impact on our performance or career? For a lot of people, the chances are it wasn't from an e-learning course, right? It could be from a book, it could be from a podcast, it can be from a colleague, it could be a blog. There's just a whole vast, diverse range of things we could be learning from. And it really depends on that moment of need, right? For some things, it's a blog does the job. For other things, maybe you do need more of a structured, scaffolded approach to how you learn. And that kind of range is what I refer to as the learning ecosystem, is how do you bring this together? Because no longer is kind of L&D's role about creating content, but it's about curating the ecosystem, because we need access to that. And there's a lot of friction in finding that, but that's what the ecosystem is.
So it's about connecting that range of learning resources into one system that an organization can tap into, correct?
Yeah, I guess even before you get to the point of bringing it together is recognizing that there is a bigger ecosystem than just the e-learning courses that you might be pushing or the classroom training that you're running within your organization. And I think that realization is an important one, to acknowledging that people are learning with or without L&D, right? And that might be a hard one to kind of digest, but that doesn't make L&D redundant. Actually, it puts more of an importance on L&D, because it's a lot of time, effort, and energy and friction to be able to find the relevant resources from this learning ecosystem. And so, L&D's role really is to reduce the friction from people being able to get the maximum value from this learning ecosystem. And that journey starts recognizing there's a big old ecosystem out there.
Now, I want to get to L&D's role in reducing friction in just a moment, but there's something that you said that I want to just tap into a little bit more. When you mentioned that there's more to learning than just these courses, these online certification things, right? Those are what would be considered a 10% if we're looking at like a 70-20-10 model, correct? So what I'm hearing you say is 20% of learning is also out there. There's also that 70% learning that we need to be cognizant of in terms of an entire range. Are you in line with that methodology?
Yeah, I'm not too sure how I feel about the kind of 70-20-10. Often I'm reluctant to go down anything that prescribes a one size fits all approach, right? So I think it's
Mm-hmm.
quite a leap to say this is how everyone should be learning 70-20-10. But I think the sentiment is true. The sentiment of alluding to there are different types of learning experiences that are fit for different moments of need. I agree with that. But I actually think the ratios are different for each person. And,
Mm-hmm.
based on the job you're doing, the moments that matter in your kind of day to day, what's happening in your career, what's happening in your life, what are the skills that you need to, the skills gaps that you need to close. I think all of those things will drive your own ratio. But yeah, absolutely. It points towards the fact that courses, in its sense, the idea of us sitting down to do a 3-hour course to learn all the skills we need, I think most people can agree that's not how we're currently building skills, right? To a large degree. And there are many other learning experiences that we have that are not courses. And I think it's moving away from that. And even when you look at within an organization, there's kind of a disproportionate amount of budget that's spent on courses and classroom training compared
Mm-hmm.
to the amount of time that's actually spent by an average employee on these courses, right? They're actually spending more of their time on other things that right now are probably happening outside of the visibility of L&D teams. And there it's almost kind of out of sight, out of mind. And we're only really tracking and focusing on this course. That's all I care about. I start with the content. I've pushed this content out. Have you done it? Have you not done it? How much time did you spend on it? And it's kind of really going away from content focus to a more kind of ecosystem approach.
Mm. I love that you mentioned learning experiences are not prescribed and individualized instead. I think that's really an important takeaway here. So, why is it important for organizations to build learning ecosystems then within their workplaces?
Yeah, so it goes back to recognizing that there is so much out there, both inside and outside of the organization, and really building and cultivating that learning ecosystem is about bringing together the very best knowledge from inside the company, but the very best knowledge from outside and across the world. And if you imagine each individual, each one of us does that on a day-to-day basis, right? When
Mhm.
we're searching for stuff, our colleagues and friends are recommending things. But in searching and finding and curating and qualifying all of this is a lot of effort and a lot of friction. That's stopping us from connecting with the most relevant learning that's going to shape my performance in those moments that matter. So what we're all trying to do is how do we connect you with that relevant learning as quickly as possible to help you perform better in that moment that mattered. And if we're trying to cut down the time to get there, the first step in organizations helping people build those skills that matter as quickly as possible is in bringing together that ecosystem, and then helping people connect with the most relevant resources within that ecosystem is the role you can play. And I often make the kind of analogy of, if you think about this almost like the conductor of an orchestra, it's like one of the most visible jobs in the world, but most people don't understand what that person's doing, right? Like, can the musicians not play without the conductor? Of course they can, but the conductor's there to make sure people are aligned and playing in time, in harmony. And I almost look at L&D's role as the conductor of the L&D orchestra, right? It's not,
Mm.
you're no longer playing one of the instruments, which is creating a course. You're now actually the conductor of the entire orchestra. And you're bringing this together, right? You're supporting, curating informal learning resources. You're empowering your internal experts to share knowledge with each other. And so you're, helping bring that orchestra together rather than just being one part of it.
Mm. And is that a shift that you're seeing then in the L&D space, is going from being the course creators to more of like the conductors of all learning experience?
Absolutely. And I think a big realization, there's a couple of shifts that are driving this. I think the first one is there's a huge amount of talent shortage, right? And I think a
Mm.
couple of things, there's an incredible statistic that shows for the first time ever, even in a tightening um, economic climate, we're still seeing high levels of employment, right? Which has never happened before. Normally, when you're seeing an economic downturn, actually there are high levels of unemployment. That's not happening. And so what this is telling us, actually, the talent shortage isn't a temporary thing. It's actually going to be here for a while. And there are other data that supports this, which is, there are 6 open job roles for every qualified person who can do that job, right? And over 70% of companies are losing their talent because of a lack of growth opportunities. Now, what this tells you is there's so much opportunity out there that people who want to be supported in their career are willing to leave companies, even in a market like this, because they know there's so much opportunity out there, and they'll keep looking until they find the company that's going to support their growth. And growth starts with learning and building the skills that you need as quickly as possible for you to progress in your career. And I think there's a realization in L&D now is we need to put the needs of the talent first rather than our content needs, right? It's not about I have a course and that dictates what I learn, when I learn, where I learn. Actually, we need to flip it around and go, I need to find out what are the skills gaps, what do my talent need, and let that dictate what they learn, when they learn, and where they learn. And to be able to personalize that experience at scale, you can't do it if L&D are playing the role of content creators. And that's when the realization kicks in. Actually, the only way I'm going to be able to meet so many different demands and needs in the organization is by becoming the curator of learning experiences rather than the creator of one piece of content. And that shift is the only way we're going to meet the needs. And it's the only way every company today needs to be a talent first organization, right? We need to be putting the needs and demands of the talent first because it's getting competitive. And if we don't do that, companies are going to struggle to have the talent to just get work done, let alone innovate and grow. Just to simply get work done, they're going to struggle to have the talent. So I think in every organization shift to becoming talent first, they will have to take an approach where they're thinking about a learning ecosystem rather than just content.
Yeah, thank you so much. So employees are in the driver's seat more than ever before, is what I'm hearing you say. And there's a huge amount of pressure on organizations to build these learning ecosystems, because that gets into the why, what you just mentioned, the talent shortage. Employees being in the driver's seat can go out and find their next opportunity if they're not currently receiving it. So organizations that can harvest these opportunities within their organizations are going to retain the most amount of individuals and high qualified talent, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
mhm,
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an expensive problem, right? I
yeah.
think it costs almost 1.5 to 2 times someone's salary to replace
Mm,
them. And that doesn't take into account the missed revenue. If you've you've just lost your best salesperson and, it's going to take you 6 months to replace and ramp someone up. That's 6 months of missed quota that you could have been getting in. It costs you a fraction to solve this problem versus the cost of not solving this problem. And just one other thing
mhm,
to add in terms of what's driving this trend is, if you go kind of 2 decades ago, businesses were the primary buyers of technology. And what you end up with essentially is a handful of power users in these companies who are using tech. But today, every single one of us is a power user of tech, right? We're all using far more sophisticated tech as consumers in our personal lives than we are at work. And
mm,
what this has driven is a trend of consumerization of starting with IT, but what we're seeing now is the consumerization of work. We now expect work to give us a very similar experience to what we get as consumers in our personal lives. And if you compare what that is, as a consumer, we're used to getting personalized, omni-channel experiences. And that's what we expect from work. And we're already seeing this shift from, a generic cubicle office space to, flexible working and co-working and hot desking. We're seeing the move away from annual performance reviews to continuous feedback cycles. And this is all of a shift towards that kind of employee-centric employee experience, which is coming from this consumerization of work. Similarly, we're seeing the same demand on L&D, right? People are demanding learning resources and experiences that are personalized and omni-channel and delivered in a timely manner, because that's what we get as a consumer. And we're not going to take anything less from work. And if I'm getting anything less from work, I'm going to look elsewhere where I'm going to get that. And I think that's the other trend that's driving this behavior.
Yeah, so it's almost like people are demanding a lifestyle learning experience. They want it to fit the flow of the work that they're in. It doesn't necessarily look the same for every individual, for every job role within an organization. And I want to go back to a challenge that I see in organizations when they do tap into the growth and development opportunities that they have when they do build these learning ecosystems is the way that they set their employees up for success around growth and development. Is what I'm hearing is growth and development isn't always necessarily equivalent to promotion. However, when organizations start building out these learning ecosystems, sometimes employees can maybe not understand or misunderstand that learning is and growth and development is not a prescription to a promotion. Are you seeing that, or how are you seeing organizations kind of tackle that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great point. And the risk there is we need to appreciate learning is the means to an end. It's not the end. And I think in organizational cultures where you kind of set the expectation, if you learn X or get this qualification, you're now ready to be promoted, is the wrong expectation. And actually, it's counterintuitive for building a learning culture, because the moment they don't get that promotion, you've now created a negative feedback loop where they're now associating, well, I did that learning, I got that qualification, but I didn't get the promotion. And that negative feedback loop now means I'm not going to engage with internal L&D or learning, because I feel like it's not giving me the positive result I was out for. And I think we need to bring it back to how you learn. Are you able to apply what you're learning? And is that translating into better performance? And it's that better performance that drives your career growth. And so it's almost understanding the other steps in between that. The other kind of mistake or challenge I see companies get themselves into is they get employee engagement feedback saying there's not enough growth opportunities. They're hearing it in exit interviews. They're getting it in employee NPS. Head of HR is hearing it from the C-suite. They go, what are we going to do about this? And so companies rush to bringing in a more structured career progression framework, which is great, right? It's great. But what we need to appreciate is a career progression framework tells you where I could get to, right? And if it's a good one, it might even tell me what I need to demonstrate to progress to the next step. But it tells me the what I need, but it doesn't tell me how I can get there. And all that does, by putting in a career progression framework, but not giving any support to help people learn what they need and build the skills they need, actually just amplifies the frustration they were feeling. Because now they're even more frustrated, because they're like, I can get to level 3. You're literally not supporting me in any way to get to level 3, right? How do I get that skill? What do I need to know? How can I learn that? And so I often think people need to stop thinking about it in a silo where they think they can tick the box by putting in a progression framework and telling you which direction to go in. You need to look at the end-to-end experience of, I've told you now where you can get to. We agree, this is your path. Now let's talk about how we're going to help you. What in this learning ecosystem can really help you build the skills you need to do better at your job, and as a consequence, progress in your career.
And that how is where L&D can really, really support an
Absolutely.
organization, right? Because to your point with the career progression, telling someone where they can go, what they need to do to get there doesn't tell them the how. What do I need to do to learn these skills? What are the resources that are available to me? and what's the ecosystem that I can tap into as an individual learner, then I feel like I have the opportunity to then sit in the driver's seat, take that initiative, and learn, apply, and then perform, right? So the steps in between the driving performance for a growth or a promotion. So I love that you share that. Now, this next question that I have for you, I don't want you to be shy. You have to tell everyone about your company, because when it comes to building a learning ecosystem, I think HowNow does an incredible job at providing that space. So tell me, how do you build a learning ecosystem?
Yeah, and thank you for giving me the chance to talk about it. But at HowNow, essentially, it's a platform built to reduce that friction in terms of building that learning ecosystem and connecting people with the relevant learning in those moments that matter. And how we go about doing that, I'll break it down into kind of 4 steps. Is we do start with the talent first, right? Is rather than, let's compare the traditional approach to L&D versus a talent first approach to L&D. The traditional approach would send out a learning needs survey once every 6 months, once every year. And a learning needs survey is what it says on the tin. You know, I'm asking for what courses, what content do you need, right? And it's still a very much a content focused approach. Whereas in a talent first approach, what we help you do with HowNow is understand what skills you have and don't have in the business. And what are the skills gaps that each individual has, right? And so you're now actually understanding what are the skill requirements at an individual level. That's the first stage, is how do we understand what people need? The second one is now, how do we create a learning experience using this ecosystem rather than just content? So your traditional L&D would essentially author an e-learning course or host a classroom training. But with HowNow, with Talent First L&D, what we recommend is, well, we can integrate with all of your internal systems, because you're probably using knowledge that lives inside Google Drive, SharePoint, OneDrive, and then you might have third-party content libraries, right? And then you've got multiple different providers for different teams, different roles, different needs. And then you've got all of the incredible content that exists outside of your company, right? So, the blogs, podcasts that we spoke about, which we integrate with. And then there's the tribal knowledge, right? Well, right now, if you don't have something like HowNow in place, chances are there's a lot of knowledge that's being shared and lost in tools like Slack and Microsoft Teams. And you essentially have a leaky bucket where all of that is being lost in the flow of conversation. Some poor person is stuck there, answering the same questions over and over again, very inefficient. So we bring all of that together into a single searchable platform and help you organize all of that learning and knowledge based on the skills and topics that it covers, right? And so you can bring that together, and now you can either build pathways and playlists and target people based on their skills gaps, or we can drive smart recommendations based on the skills gaps that we've identified, or people can search for it. Rather than searching in 20 different places, they now have one single front door where they can search their entire learning ecosystem in one go. And once you do that, you now need to be able to deliver that in the flow of work, right? Rather than just ad hoc one place that's siloed, which is traditional L&D, where we drag people away from work into an LMS. At HowNow, what we do is we say, actually, that makes no sense. Why don't we take the learning and knowledge to where people are working and meet the employee where they are? So we integrate into all the apps that you might use on a day-to-day basis. That's your CRM, your help desk, your chat tools. Wherever you are, you have on-demand access to relevant learning. And the last one is what you measure, right? Your traditional approach to L&D is you measure how much time someone spent on learning, and also did they complete it or not, because it's still very content focused, right? I'm only interested in what you did related to that content. But actually with HowNow, we take a big picture thinking. You can track engagement. What are people searching for? Did they find something that was relevant to their search? Did they complete it? Did they engage with it, etc.? But then you can go beyond that to go, okay, did it help them build the skills they needed, right? Are they also sharing knowledge, right? Because that's a big part of learning and building that community of learning. So you can track far more in terms of seeing, are you building a learning culture? Is it actually having meaningful impact? And you can absolutely do all of those different things without tech, but it would be an absolute nightmare and a lot of work and a lot of friction. And so I'm often, I shouldn't really be saying this as someone who's a founder of a SaaS company, but technology is a part of the solution, right? If you're going to keep the same old playbook, but you're going to try to bring in a new bit of tech, it's not going to work, right? You need to have the mindset shift. You need to work towards changing the internal culture and playbook combined with the right tool. It's game changing.
There's so much that I love about HowNow as a platform. Like you mentioned, one of the things about connecting all of your different systems, you're not starting from scratch, right? Like you are being able to tap into those other systems that are already existing. And what I also love is the power that it gives individual contributors within the organization to contribute their knowledge. It's not now an L&D role. Now learning and the learning experience, the knowledge sharing becomes an extension of L&D. The entire company does, right? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because without that, and if you take kind of traditional L&D approach, L&D very quickly would become bottleneck, right? It's just impossible. Even if you're a company of, let's just say, 200 people, it's absolutely impossible for one L&D person to create every bit of content that's going to be relevant to every individual's needs in that organization.
Right.
And what we need to do there is really tap into the internal experts that we have. And it's a very expensive mistake not to do this. And going back to my point around kind of leaky bucket, imagine, someone who's been in the company for the last 5 years, they've learned a ton of great stuff, and then they leave. When they leave, all of that good stuff leaves with them. And in this day and age, no company can afford to relearn the things that they once knew. We've just about got enough time to learn the new things that we need to learn. And so every time you lose that valuable knowledge, you are actually falling behind. You might not feel it now, but over a period of time, once that compounds, as more people leave, you will really feel the consequences of that. And so by empowering and also enabling with the right tech stack for people to easily share that knowledge and store it, save it, organize it in one place, what you start to do is essentially build a company brain, right? You're kind of tapping into your collective intelligence and building on what other people know. And this really came to the forefront during the pandemic when we started working from our homes, and people realized we can no longer swivel in our seat, tap on someone's shoulder, and ask them that question, or overhear and learn from just kind of overhearing things that were happening in the office. We now had to be a lot more deliberate, right? And so what people started doing once they started working from home is they started doing virtual shoulder taps, right? They started slacking people or sending Microsoft Teams messages going, oh, what was the answer to that question? Or how do I do that? And you end up with the kind of repeat questions that I mentioned earlier. And so really tapping into the experts that you have. And often I think L&D rush to look for the external expert without ever actually having checked whether you have an internal expert for that, right? Like, how often do we hear bringing in an external Excel instructor when I'm pretty sure in your company there are probably a few Excel wizards who could help you out?
That's huge. And for organizations and leaders that are listening, this is incredibly powerful if you are building succession planning, you're doing career pathing, but specifically succession planning, as you're talking about kind of that knowledge retention within an organization, that knowledge sharing. So, in terms of making this really tangible, thinking about all of this collective intelligence as a reservoir for all of the knowledge within the company, what are some different things that can exist within the L&D platform, or the LXP is really what it is, right? It's a learning
Yeah.
experience platform. What are the different items? You mentioned courses, but are there other things that we can add as pieces of nuggets that individuals can tap to?
Yeah, for sure. Like there's the shared knowledge itself, right? These are just kind of answers to imagine going back to the consumer experience again. Many of us have probably used tools like Quora, right? Where you
Mhm.
go, you see a bunch of questions, experts who have answered that. Where's my equivalent at work, right? And that's where, for example, in HowNow, people use nuggets to share that kind of nugget of knowledge. And then you've got job aids, right? Some things like checklists and great examples of how people use HowNow. Customer facing teams, for example. Imagine I'm on a demo to a customer. They're asking me questions about recent product releases. I could just pull up HowNow on the side using my browser extension and pull up answers to these product questions, right? These are job aids. I don't need a course for that, right? I just need to have something that's going to support me in that moment of need. Support calls, getting up to date answers that are accurate, trusting for me to be able to answer back to customers. That's one example. Coaching, mentoring, right? For be able to pair up people, match them up. We have kind of peer to peer feedback sessions where we review calls that we've had with customers collectively, where everyone's open to share feedback on what they could have done better, what they did do well. These are different ways of learning and sharing knowledge with each other, building that kind of community of experts. Hackathons, there's so many different ways of, we've seen companies organize hackathons, people book through via HowNow, they get together, work on ideas that might seemingly seem kind of unconnected to your day-to-day work, but actually they build those foundational skills that help you work better together. And again, it goes back to the point of the learning ecosystem. It's so vast and diverse. And right now, most organizations are probably only tapping into a very, very small part of it.
Yeah, and you know what's coming to mind for me as we're having this discussion that a lot of organizations may need support on streamlining is that first impression when an individual literally walks into an organization their first week, right? They're onboarding. I can definitely see onboarding pathways like really helping individuals kind of pace that self-learning journey that they need to go through as they're learning a new company, all of the systems, the processes, the tools. It's a lot. It's like drinking from a fire hose when you first start with a company. So to have one single source of truth to go to and to be able to access at your own pace, I think would be incredibly powerful experience for new individuals.
And I think the other benefit is really the speed at which we now need to serve our internal customers, right, is increasing, right? Where it makes no sense if you're going to take some time to discover the problem and then it's actually going to take you another 6 months to work with the internal expert to turn that into a course because only L&D are creating content. The kind of opportunity or the potential threat, that moment has passed, right? And so what we need to get better as L&D in an organization is better at kind of serving that need when the need is there, right? Not once it's passed. And to do that, we need faster ways of getting the learning experience that's going to meet that need. And often content creation isn't the way to do that, right? It's curating is a far more faster way of meeting that need than creation. And what people need to realize is actually we're living in a post-content world. If I was to say, there's content is both cheap, abundant, and so the problem there isn't the content. There's a ton of content out there. Our biggest challenge is discovering the most relevant, valuable content for me in this moment of need is our biggest challenge. It's a discovery problem, not a content
Discovery problem.
right?
So that's one of the challenges learners are facing as they navigate within learning ecosystems is identifying what they need out of the abundance of learning that exists, right?
Absolutely. I mean, anyone who's sat on Netflix and scrolled for 30 minutes, not knowing what to pick, I mean, that's essentially without the curation and the smarter recommendation and person, that's essentially what you're putting your learners through, right? Is they're looking at a ton of this stuff. They're like, well, I know I need to go here, but how are these thousands of things? And, often again, the traditional L&D approach is to focus on content. And what people end up doing is buying the largest content library in the world. None of your employees are saying they want the largest content library in the world. They just want the one bit of learning resources that's going to help them do what they do better and help them progress in their career. And I think it is shifting that mindset from kind of content obsession to more around putting talent needs first and how do we curate an ecosystem that can support that. And when you have an ecosystem, it's also easier to drive self-directed learning, right? Because you've now done the hard work of curating this ecosystem where people can find what they need when they need it. But when you've not done the work of bringing that ecosystem together, L&D within your organization is largely dependent on the content that you create and push out to the workforce, which isn't sufficient.
So that's where L&D teams also really, going back to their role as a conductor, can tap into a lot of the the tracking of what the needs are within a learning ecosystem so that they can help to deliver and push that out as well. So it's almost like a bi-directional process. But
Absolutely.
as learners are trying to navigate learning ecosystems and choose what's important for them, what's a priority versus not important, right? If you're thinking about how to prioritize learning, I imagine it would require some feedback loops, right? So I need to have that as a collaborative process with my manager to better understand where are my shortcomings, my blind spots, and to be able to review those skills on a continuous basis. Is that one of the ways that learners can overcome that challenge? Is not just by looking at all of the content that exists and choosing just randomly, but having these continuous feedback cycle conversations with their managers, with those around them to learn how important certain skills are for them.
Absolutely. It's a question around how can we close skills gaps
Mm,
if we're not measuring skills in the first place, right? How would we know, right? And so I think it fundamentally comes back to like any other KPI we measure in the organization, revenue, conversion rates, etc. This is a fundamental KPI. Do you have the skills in the business to be able to deliver your business goals? Because if your C-suite are coming up with business goals but you don't actually have the skills to be able to deliver that, you're setting yourself up for failure. So it starts with the idea of, okay, we need to measure skills, right? Like any other KPI, we need to put a number to this. And so there are different ways of doing this. You can either go down the objective route where I give you an assessment. You do that assessment based on how you perform. We give you a proficiency score. Now, my problem with the objective approach is there's almost an inherent self-fulfilling prophecy where just because I ace an exam, just because I aced a leadership exam doesn't make me a great leader, right? It takes out the kind of application of it and getting the real world feedback. So at HowNow, we take a more subjective approach where our worldview is if you've learned something and you are applying it in your day-to-day at work, the best people to evidence that are the people who work with you, your
mm,
colleagues, your managers. And so what you do is almost a kind of a mini 360, right? From a skills perspective, where I give myself a self-assessment. I invite my colleagues and my managers to give me an assessment. Now I get an average score. Now, very quickly, what you have is now a number that's easier to track. I can see that, okay, this group of people are right now a level 3 in leadership, but we need to get them to a level 4 or a level 5 for them to be able to progress in their career. Let's see how we're going to move this number. We can get them to do some learning, recommend some pathways, and keep checking in from a skills perspective. Now, if that process was long and cumbersome, people won't update it as often as you need them to do it, right? And
mm.
that's where I think a lot of people get it wrong is they come up with this very long assessment, which might be great in getting your first number, but actually, how often are people going to update and do that? Now, if they're doing it once a year, it's not soon enough or it's not frequent enough. And that's why at HowNow we take a deliberately light approach, which is very quick for us to give ourselves a number rating. And that's a conversation starter. Because as a manager, when I speak to the person in my team, we can use this number as a starting point for our conversation to go, okay, I can see you gave yourself a 5, but I gave you a 3. So let's have that conversation, right? Why do you
Mm.
think you're right? And that's what it needs to be. It needs to be that starting point for having the right type of performance and talent development conversations so we can better tailor the support we give the people in our team.
It's a pulse check. It's a barometer check.
That's right.
Absolutely. Now, Nelson, there are organizations who are not measuring skills, who don't even have skills identified. Are you seeing that?
Absolutely, more
Yeah.
more often than the other way. I think there are more
Hmm.
organizations who are still not measuring skills or don't have an understanding of what skills exist in the business, and
Mm.
it's a very scary place to be because you're unaware, and sometimes ignorance is bliss, and you might think it's all good because you don't know, but it's an expensive problem, and you're leaving money on the table, right? You're
Right.
leaving money on the table because you're either not tapping into the talent that you have, or there are gaps in your talent gaps in your organization that's holding you back. and you might be investing in the wrong initiatives, right? You might think, oh, it's that tool, or we need to hire more people, or you're making less informed business decisions because you don't have this metric at hand. And I think often sometimes the thing that stops people is, well, how do I know what skills this person should have, right? And again, there are different ways of doing this. I've seen organizations who spend a lot of time doing the internal jobs to skills mapping. And, you know, there are pros and cons for that approach. One thing to be aware of is if it's taking you 9 months to pull this list together, whose responsibility is it to keep this up to date, right? Because it's going to take a lot of effort to continuously keep this up to date. You can also buy taxonomies and libraries these days. At HowNow, we take an approach where we collect and analyze job market data. So we essentially scrape job adverts, identify what the most in-demand skills are for any particular job. So if your job is head of sales, we look at the job market and say, actually, these are the 20 skills. That's one way of doing it. Again, it has its pros and cons, just like any other approach. But we take that approach because rather than a few people making a subjective decision on what skills are needed, we think, let's use big data. Let's look at a large set of job market data. And the job market says these are the most in-demand skills. And you're tracking that for trends. To give you an example, one of the things we found was in the early days when we started and we were looking at this data, for a designer role, Photoshop was one of the most in-demand skills for a product designer. Yeah. Today, it's not even on that list. It's Figma, right? And so to be able to track that change, that's where job market data comes in handy. And I think what it does for people, it gives you that kind of starting foundation. Now you can contextualize it for your own organization, right? You might say, actually, a designer in our company, we want them to have these skills plus these 4 skills that we think are relevant in the organization. It's definitely a painful process, like any 0 to 1 process is. But actually it's going to cause a lot more pain not measuring skills to start off with.
Yeah, what I love about skills as a skills-based organization is that skills are agile and they're transferable, right? As you mentioned, you can have that external research to kind of back up what the important skills are for job roles. And within the organization that I work for, we are a skills-based organization, and we've developed a skills framework or architecture, if you will, where there's technical industry skills for every job, which we kind of keep it to, let's say, a limit of 10 at the most. And then we have soft skills, which aren't the soft skills. We know that. We talk about this a lot on my podcast. But those are the harder skills, the people skills, the interpersonal skills that are required by job level. So individual contributor, manager, director, and up. So those are the individual soft skills versus technical industry skills that kind of make up a compository of what's needed to be successful in those roles. And they're easy to change in and out, especially the technical and industry, because if something like Photoshop isn't going to be required for that job, right? Yeah. You can switch that out pretty easily. The soft skills, they pretty much stay the same throughout, unless you, for example, for the pandemic that we had, our executive level skill, there was one that didn't exist called crisis management. And we added that after the pandemic because we realized what a need it is at that executive level to have to be able to make decisions when we come across crises like the pandemic. Right. And so that was an opportunity for us to reformat, but also the value of skills is that it drives the L&D efforts. It really does. Having an understanding of what their business needs are and the gaps within individuals, it's just so powerful.
Absolutely. It gives you a common language, right? I think for L&D, the traditional L&D, talking about course completion rates is not a language that the rest of the business understands, right? And that's often the reason why there's challenges with communicating the impacts and where businesses kind of don't appreciate the value L&D bring to the table, because actually we're not talking about it in a language that the rest of the business understands. Whereas skills is that common language, right? It is a people manager or head of another function understands that we need to have these skills to be able to do this job well. And you're saying, I get you need these skills. And actually, this is how we're going to help you build those skills. So it's a language that brings it together. And that's why it's a useful bit of data that connects to business. And we see in organizations where there is a more kind of skills centric approach, there's more buy-in for
There's
L&D
more
because
buy-in.
people genuinely think it's aligned more to what the business is talking about, what the business's needs are. And so, look, if you're an L&D professional and you find yourself being in a team where you feel like you're being undervalued, you're not getting the budget you want, it's probably worth asking that question of, am I speaking in the language that the rest of the business understands?
So powerful. Well, this has been such a fun chat. And I have one final question for you as we wrap up here. And it's a question I ask everyone on this show. What is the most recent paradigm shift that you've experienced? It could be related to this work or anything else outside.
Wow, it's a big old question. But I thought the one to talk about was really, as the company has grown, we obviously started as founders, 0 to 1, starting in a coffee shop. And at that point, you're going from building a product so that as the company grows, you now shift into a gear where you're now building a company, right? Which is, you're still building something, but it requires a different set of skills and nuances. And, you're often trying to find better ways of prioritizing what you do. And the kind of age old way of the Eisenhower matrix of, urgent, important, but I'd add a kind of another dimension, see it almost like a 3D box rather than a flat matrix, is leverage, right? I think one of the kind of paradigm shifts for me has really been thinking about, yes, is it urgent? Is it important? But how much leverage does this activity give me? Is it a high leverage activity where, the kind of reach and scale of the impact, right? By doing this one task or this one activity, actually it's a high leverage one because it's going to affect 4 teams for a longer period of time versus a kind of smaller leverage activity would have an impact on one particular team, right? And so thinking about in terms of what's a high leverage activity for that 1 hour you put in. And actually, I'm a big believer L&D is a high leverage activity, right? It's the classic case of I'm a new manager. Often we go through this friction where do I teach this person how to do it? Or is it just easier for me to just go in and do it, right? Everyone who's been a manager at some point in their life for the first time goes through this transition where you're like, this is taking too long. Should I just do it? And it's a key moment in a manager's life where you realize that high leverage activity is actually delegating and teaching or upskilling that person to do it well. Although it's taking a lot of time in the short run, it's the high leverage activity, right? Whereas the kind of short term win, but kind of less leverage is for me to go, you know what, step to the side, let me do this for you, and you can pick it up from there. And so, yeah, I think my paradigm shift has been really thinking about activities, tasks, and decisions I make as high leverage or not.
Well, thank you, because you just shifted my paradigm on the Eisenhower matrix. I have never considered that before. Wow, to make it 3D and consider leverage, because impact is scalable, right? Then you think about all the individuals that you are impacting off of that one decision that you make. So, so powerful. Thank you so much, Nelson, for your time, for your energy, for your wisdom. And anyone who is interested in Nelson or the platform and the company that he was sharing called HowNow, and or his book, Learning at Speed, which gives a lot of wisdom, frameworks, and information around how you can upskill and reskill your workforce, please be sure to visit the show notes.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to leave a review, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening. If you know a business leader in practice or friend who you think would be interested in this episode, please consider sharing it with them. I am so grateful for your support. For more updates, you can follow us at Paradigm Shifts Podcast on Instagram. See you on the next episode.